Righty, happy days.
We're live.
Hello, we're just waiting for a few more people to attend online and in person. So you may talk amongst yourselves whilst we're just waiting for a few more people to attend. Could I just, for those of you who've joined online, there will be two options of how to participate. One is to put your hand up, because I've got the chat and I can see hand functions. Please wait to be addressed. The alternative is to type a question into the chat box. Could I ask whether anyone online can clearly hear what's happening?
Sorry.
Questions on vaccination?
Oh, yeah, okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen.
What we're hearing from Luke, who is the administrator, is financially she can't afford to
Ask those people that themselves. Two, one, two, eight. Your microphone to mute. I'm muting you. Okay. Welcome to those that have joined online and those present in the room. My name is Matthew Skinner. I'm a general and infectious diseases physician working at Sir Charles Gardner Hospital. I'm currently seconded at King Edward as the Director of Clinical Services there. So I've been asked to try and help, obviously, because the 1st of November is looming very close, which is when all Tier 2 personnel are meant to receive their first vaccination. Otherwise, they will unfortunately not be able to return to a health site and work in their current employment, as per the mandated requirement from the Chief Health Officer and the Department of Health. So I'm here to try and answer questions that you may or may not have, and I'm not necessarily going to change your mind because it's your choice whether you get vaccinated or don't get vaccinated. I'm just here to remind you that everything that we do has consequences and actions. Obviously, the issue in this case is some of those consequences and actions are very significant. I have previously talked a little bit or had done some other previous podcasts or covcasts, if we sort of said. So just to recap, coronavirus came from China. It spread worldwide, started probably at the end of 2019, but was declared a worldwide pandemic in early 2020. And as of just yesterday, approximately 246 million cases have been identified as having coronavirus that we know of. And some estimates worldwide would suggest that that number could be up to 10 times the number of people that have been infected with coronavirus throughout the world. To date, just short of 5 million deaths have been associated with coronavirus, again, that we know of. Unfortunately, 223 million people have recovered. completely recovered from this infection. If you're interested in league tables, I would suggest you look at Worldometer. It's a very cheap and easy sort of thing to find out where things are at. USA leads the pack, followed by India, then Brazil. UK is 4th, and Russia is 5th on the list. China, where the infection originated, has less than 100,000 people officially diagnosed and is 113th, and Australia is 99th on the list with close to 165,000 people diagnosed as confirmed diagnosis of coronavirus. And in terms of vaccinations, there are 3 vaccines that are available in Australia. There's the AstraZeneca vaccine that uses a particular platform called an adenovirus vector platform to result in immunity against coronavirus. And Pfizer and Moderna use messenger RNA vaccine technology but all 3 work on the principle that they're creating a spike protein, which is the most immunogenic part of the coronavirus, and the body recognizes this protein as being foreign, produces an antibody, and that antibody protects you against subsequent coronavirus infection. And the best immunity is developed or created when you have 2 vaccines initially. And now, obviously, we're now talking about boosters, so 3rd vaccines to come in due course. I don't know if anyone has any particular question or something that they have read or concerned about or worried. I'm leaving it open to you guys on the floor here or in the chat room to ask what is the thing, or what are they either most concerned about, what have they heard, what are they worried about from media or anything like that. I'm trying to answer questions as best as I can. I might not have every answer, but I'm going to give it a go.
Lately, I've just heard a bit about pericarditis and myocarditis. So,
yeah, so like any therapy that is introduced, there are side effects. So nothing is benign or banal. Yeah. Okay, so the question was the side effect of pericarditis or myocarditis that's coming out. So what I would say, first of all, is the safety, efficacy and profiles of all vaccine have gone through the usual clinical trial process. The clinical trial process is a 3-step process. The first is making sure that any product is safe in healthy volunteers. The second step is making sure that you find the correct dose for that, whilst building on the previous clinical trial of safety. And the third clinical trial that is done is, again, looking at the target population, and again, building on all of the side effect or safety profile from before. And usually in the clinical trials process, you will detect the incidence of side effects or problems at rates of somewhere between 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 10,000. After that, when something goes to market, there's ongoing surveillance that happens, and that starts picking up rarer or more unusual side effects. So in the situation of pericarditis and myocarditis, yes, it happens. It happens with the messenger RNA vaccines, that's Pfizer and Moderna, at a rate of less than 1 in 100,000. So given that we have delivered almost 7 billion vaccines worldwide, it is not surprising that some of these rarer side effects are being reported as part of a surveillance network. Who is at risk are those people that have had pericarditis or myocarditis in the past due to unknown causes, not necessarily those that have had viral infections, not necessarily those that get myocarditis or pericarditis after having a heart attack, which sometimes happens. So yes, it can occur. it's an immune-mediated or immune reaction, just like in AstraZeneca, the clot was recorded, again, at a rate of a similar nature, at worst case, 1 in 100,000. So again, in post-marketing surveillance, it was picked up and found. Because we now know about them, we're attuned to it. So most medical staff are aware of these reactions and side effects. So the risk of dying or having a severe or serious complication is much less than what it was at the beginning when we didn't realise this. But this is the nature of new things. This is what happens. But I would make you think about and go back to, if you're worried or you're worried about, okay, well, I don't want to have the vaccine because of this risk or that risk. I will put it in context. Did you drive to work today? Risk of having a car accident is about 10-fold greater than the risk of having myocarditis or pericarditis. So 1 in 10,000 versus 1 in 100,000. It didn't necessarily stop you from doing that. I understand it's new, it's different, but what you need to do is weigh up risks versus benefits. The other thing is difficult, obviously, in WA because we don't have COVID. We really don't have COVID circulating in the community. But the best way in sort of preparing us when borders open and when coronavirus will be circulating in the community is being vaccinated now.
I don't want to be like doing questions from that and breastfeeding.
Mm-hmm. So before I get on to your question, Warren, Milan has said that COVID would be coded IFR would be better understood as compared with other causes of death. It would give necessary context and reference. Would appreciate a comment. So Milan, I said that the rate of myocarditis, pericarditis, 1 in 100,000 vaccine doses, that's not death. Death from pericarditis and myocarditis is much less related. So we're talking something much less than 1 in a million. Infection fatality rate. Okay, so the infection fatality rate for COVID under the age of 50 is less than 1%. At the age of decade for 50, in someone in their 50s is about 1%. In their 60s, it's 2%. In their 70s, it's 4%. It doubles. In their 80s, it's 8%, etc. So that's the rough or the crude infection fatality rate. So it's very difficult because it also depends on what's happening in the community at the time. So in the absence of circulating or transmitting COVID, the infection fatality rate here in WA is exceedingly low. But if you took it after, so Charles Gardner Hospital received 2 patients from the Ruby Princess that docked in Japan and had 2 people come down, and we were involved in the first death reported in Australia as a result of COVID in 2020. So if you took the case fatality rate at that point in time, we had 2 patients, the case fatality rate was 50%. But over time, more people are getting infected. And overall, the case fatality rate sitting around 2%. But if you look at the total numbers, as I said, 245 million people have been infected, 5 million people have died. There's still a number of people that were waiting for outcomes to occur. The infection fatality rate changes from decades, changes with other conditions. Very few people have died from vaccination at this point in time. More people died earlier on when we didn't know some of these side effects and problems. Now that we understand them, we are looking for them, we're identifying them better and earlier, and there are therapies available for the treatment of pericarditis associated with Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, and there are treatments available for the clots associated with the AstraZeneca vaccine. So whilst they were rare and unusual, and some unfortunately early people that developed these complications did die, very few now are dying as a result of a complication from a vaccine. And that's true as we get more experience with newer therapies. It's the same thing as older vaccines. We've got more experience. We still have rare events that occur and side effects that occasionally occur. In terms of Warren's question about people being worried about taking vaccines during pregnancy or in breastfeeding, there are statements that have been released by the peak body for medical staff in terms of the College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists and the Chief Nursing and Midwifery Office have also recommended that women of childbearing age should receive the vaccine, irrespective of planning pregnancy, being pregnant or breastfeeding. The amount of evidence is somewhat limited, and it is obviously in those trial circumstances that I talked about earlier. Initially, you exclude vulnerable populations such as pregnant women or breastfeeding women for a number of different reasons. And the principle comes down to you don't want to add anything into a mother in the context of conception or in the early trimester so that you don't lead to any fetal anomalies. And similarly, you try not to do anything that might be passed from mother into the breast milk when you're feeding. So they're the principles that have been followed. So over time, in other parts of the world, it's become clear that there has been no signal, so no evidence that fetal abnormalities increase as a result of COVID vaccination. So that's why don't worry about in the steps of trying to conceive, and similarly not worried about which time of pregnancy that you give the vaccine. Further, what has happened and what's been shown is that pregnant women who get COVID have worse outcomes. Pregnant women are more likely to be hospitalised. Pregnant women are more likely to be put on a ventilator. Pregnant women are more likely to have premature labour and deliver undernourished or growth retarded babies. So there are significant potential effects of COVID that the vaccine will protect against. The specific, and this is really from a number of population sort of studies from other countries around the world. So that's why they've been changed as information has evolved. In terms of breastfeeding, the components of the vaccine don't get broken down and expressed in breast milk. So they get broken down quite quickly. So most of the vaccine disappears within 36 hours of the vaccination. So there's no detectable agents or products of the vaccine in breast milk, but I haven't seen the studies nor are they widely published in the literature. So again, it's based on certain aspects and understanding of the science. It may not be based on peer-reviewed literature, that sort of thing. So the information comes from case studies, case series at best. That's a level of sort of the literature available, but many experts around the world are recommending it, and it's based of cost benefit or what are the benefit versus the risks. And overall, for breastfeeding, what we do know is that whilst there's no components of the vaccine that may be present in breast milk, the antibodies that mum produces to the spike protein will be found in breast milk. So those antibodies in breast milk will be transmitted to the infant, providing additional protection for the infant against COVID. And obviously there's been no vaccine approved for children under the age of 12 at this point in time, even though studies are now being conducted. So Pfizer are doing studies to bring the age down to around 5, so school-aged. So I don't know what will happen over time. From a medical practitioner point of view, it's not really possible to provide an exemption now for someone who's pregnant or someone who's breastfeeding, because the experts are saying we should do this. These are recommendations from the peak obstetrician and gynecology service, from the midwifery components from the World Health Organization, the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, several other bodies have put out statements saying that overall it is believed that the risks of not being vaccinated are greater for the infant and from the mother than the risks associated with vaccination. And I realise that it's very hard in the absence of widespread community transmission, the absence of an impetus being present. But as I said, borders will open at some point. And because coronavirus affects humans and a number of other mammals, it is impossible to eradicate the virus from the globe and impossible to eradicate the virus to cause infection in humans. The only virus that we've successfully eradicated has been smallpox, and smallpox only infected humans. Coronavirus affects bats, heard about that, other types of mammals, apes, etc. So there's a crossover between species. So that's why it's much harder to eliminate, because you cannot eliminate the reservoir or wherever the virus may be in other animal species. And because it's spread throughout the globe, it's very hard to eliminate it from that perspective as well. So there's established transmission in many other continents around the world. So at the moment, whilst the borders are shut, we have restrictions of movement that way, we are enjoying a relatively normal life compared to New South Wales and Victoria, which have undergone lockdowns and significant community spread. And they're sort of starting their process of exiting, but even in New South Wales, their current freedoms are less than the freedoms that we have within Western Australia. I'm trying to think of what an equivalent sort of infection rate would be, and building on what Milan asked earlier. Influenza, when it's a pandemic, has a general rate of death around 0.5 to 1%. So the last significant pandemic that we were involved with was 2009, which was the swine flu sort of pandemic. And if you remember then, linking back, pregnant women did very badly with swine flu. So the same thing we're sort of seeing, some aspects of that are true for COVID. So pregnant women that get COVID have a similar sort of problems as what was seen in the 2009 swine flu pandemic. And the swine flu pandemic, again, similarly, the extremes of age were at significant risk of dying or having fatal outcomes. So whilst the overall rate might be 0.5 to 1%, it's much higher once you get over the age of 60, and also much higher in those under 12 months of age. So the only sort of nice thing in some ways for COVID is there's not as much fatality occurring in the very young. Anyone else have any questions? Go for it.
Yeah, I would like to know, today is basically my last shift because I'm not getting vaccinated. So Monday, from now on, I'm not allowed on site. My $20,000 fine otherwise. I want to know why I'm losing my job for a vaccine that is experimental, is provisional, and at the moment throughout the world, countries like Israel and several other countries that are double vaxxed and at like 80, 90% or whatever, their hospitals are full of double vaxxed patients who have succumbed to COVID and various other side effects from the vaccine. And I'm going to lose my job. We're in a state here where, as you've already said, we don't have a pandemic as such. We don't really have an emergency situation. Everything has been based on the PCR test, which, according to Carrie Mullis, he was the gentleman that, for those that don't know, was involved in the development of the PCR test, polymerase chain reaction. And he himself said that the PCR test should not be used for diagnostic purposes, which is what we're doing. It is a research tool, and basically the way it works, it's amplified. I don't know how many qualifications they do here, but the recommended by him and his team was between 20 and 25. And I believe throughout the world, a lot of places are doing up to 40 and 45. And the other thing is, and which is getting a lot of false positives. And I think a lot of people must realise too that the amount of influenza in the world has almost been eradicated because now everything's called COVID. So I really find it hard to believe that this whole system is structured in such a way that people have lost their business, their livelihood, their job, their families have broken up because they can't agree on all the stuff that's going on in the world. So I really have a problem with this whole scenario. And yeah, I don't know what the future holds for any of us.
Lots of questions raised. The first I will deal with is the emergency situation. The emergency situation has been declared by the Premier of the state and has been ongoing since 2020. So that has not been lifted. So whether you agree or disagree, the state Premier has declared that we are in a state of emergency. As a result of being in a state of emergency, the Public Health Act becomes an enforceable piece of legislation. As a result of the Public Health Act, the Chief Health Officer has delegated authorities to make mandates or rules. And his mandate is that all healthcare workers must be vaccinated by a certain date. So that is structured and legislated. So you can agree or disagree, but that's the tools, they're the parliamentary authority and the legal authority to do this.
I believe it was done by Cabinet, which does not have legal rights to actually.
So the Chief Health Officer produces something or suggests it, and in the end it is ratified by our elected officials. That's how both the Public Health Act and the Emergency Management Act work in concert together. And obviously it's been started in health, we've seen that, but we've seen the Premier increase the number of workers required or receiving mandates for vaccination. Now, coming back to the question, you said that the vaccination is experimental.
It's until 2023 on trial. So anyone that's had the vaccination is part of a clinical trial.
No.
People don't know that.
No, that is not true. A clinical trial requires you to, there have been clinical trials, as I said, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 4, which is the part of when it goes on to post-marketing and post-marketing surveillance, that's where information is being captured in general in our public health surveillance network. So we have a network around the states of the public health officers, and they collect different information about a whole range of different things. So we have notifiable diseases, and COVID has been declared a notifiable disease. But the vaccination itself, so the approval process went through the normal regulatory authorities, the Australian ATAGI, the Australian Therapeutic. I'm trying to think. So the TGA is the authority for a specific product or that sort of thing, and the advisory, the technical advisory group on immunisation has also reviewed the literature independent of the TGA to sort of see, yes, whether they do or don't recommend the vaccine based on the information that's available worldwide. So they have had access to the data that Pfizer, Moderna and AstraZeneca produced in their phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials.
That's the problem. There was no independent assessment of that. It's the drug companies that put out their own reports.
Okay, so I'm going to disagree with you that there are things that have been published in the medical literature which has to go through peer review that have substantiated a lot of these things. Similarly, the World Health Organization and the Centers for Disease Control have put out similar statements after reviewing the data independently. So yes, Big Pharma, develop the drug or develop the therapy and then go through the process, and they have their own structures and present the data, but they can't, when they're presenting to the various authorities, like in the US or whatever, they have to produce, like the Foods and Drugs Administration in the United States, they have to submit the appropriate data to show or disprove, and they are assessed independently of whatever the company suggests, and they're using the data points, the raw data, not the report that is
But it's not
generated.
independent, because Pfizer is financing the FDA, the CDC, and all of these companies. The FDA is supposed to be overseeing all of these pharmaceutical companies, and they're all in the same bucket. They're all dishing money out to them. It's like got the fox in the hen house. It's really a bit of a joke, really, as to what they're doing.
I can't dissuade what.
I've done a lot of research on. I've been, I have had vaccines in the past. I have a problem with this vaccine. It's been developed in about 10 months.
Okay,
Normal
I'm going to
vaccine
stop you
process is
there.
5 to 10 years.
Okay, so it has not been developed over 10 months. So the vaccine platforms were developed from the first episode of SARS-CoV-1. So if you remember, there was an outbreak of SARS in the early 2000s, okay? And there was a concern that as the first coronavirus potentially causing infection and crossing over between an animal reservoir into humans, again, that risk that there could be a pandemic or an epidemic develop. So fortunately it didn't. But that started some of the vaccine development and work within coronavirus vaccine.
78% of the component.
So that was the start. And then there was the Middle Eastern respiratory virus, MERS, that happened around 2010, a bit earlier. And again, it was able to, another episode, another crossover between an animal reservoir into humans, and the possibility, again, of finding out more information. What's been different about this is the more widespread and wide-scale sort of pandemic process that's happened, the dissemination of this infection throughout the world. And many people have put their hands up and contributed to those clinical trials that have been done. In addition, because of the sheer volume and numbers of people, the trials have been able to be conducted almost in parallel. So they haven't shortcut or, reduced the time or breached any of the safety requirements to be able to take it to market. Yes, it's been done over a shorter period of time because simply more people volunteered, participated in the trials, and have been exposed or potentially exposed to coronavirus. So more data and information is there. What we don't have, and this is quite reasonable, and I don't have it, is what are the impacts or effects on relatively new technology. I agree, the messenger RNA vaccine and the adenovirus vector vaccine, so that's Pfizer, Moderna versus AstraZeneca, it is newer technology, and we do not know what will happen in 10, 20, 50 years' time. What we are seeing is obviously those people are vulnerable, at risk. There's higher rates of death from COVID. The risk is, what does a population or an individual accept as a suitable risk for themselves? And that's what you have to assess yourself. And similarly, you make a choice not to be vaccinated, that is your choice. But just, unfortunately, the consequences are very different now. But all actions that we take do have consequences. Do you have any other questions or points you wish to raise?
Yeah, with regards to the mandatory vaccination of the first Australian workers came from the National Cabinet. We are a public service, the Prime Minister, the Premiers, the Chief Ministers, State and Territory Health Officers and members. The National Cabinet is simply a name for a meeting which has no constitutional, no statutory power, nor does it have any legal entity status to contract on behalf of the Commonwealth, the states and the territories. However, the members of the National Cabinet exchanged solemn promises with each other. So they made a deal amongst themselves to make administrative arrangements such as public health orders in order to give effect to what's known as the common purpose to mandatory vaccinate. So the members of the National Cabinet have merely exchanged promises with each other to make administrative arrangements. The National Cabinet have vicariously scripted the employers to do their bidding to put workers on notice, which is criminally liable.
So I agree that the National Cabinet was a body set up in this process because of a lot of things going on. And yes, there is the way our constitution is sort of set up, and we are a federated constitution, and there's certain functions that are given to the Commonwealth and other functions that are given to the state. So You're quite correct in certain parts of that I can't deny.
I've got this from a lawyer.
And what I would sort of say is that you see that the timing of some of the directives and the mandates came out at different. So, you know, the first mandate, I believe, was issued by the Minister for Health, Brian Hazard, in New South Wales, in terms of that.
Brad has it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's where the first sort of thing, but it flowed on, and yes, other states. But that's because the state has the authority under that part of the Emergency Management and Public Health Act. The Commonwealth doesn't have a rule over that. Has a requirement or need from a quarantine and setting certain things like that. And the way the quarantine was sort of set out, and part of the reason to get National Cabinet together was partly because of the fact that the Commonwealth had quarantine responsibilities, but the states really were in a better position to operationalise those Commonwealth sort of responsibilities or duties.
Yeah, but I think Morrison avoided his responsibility because he passed it to the premiers. The premiers have now passed it to the employers, and the drug companies have no liability. If any one of your family or friends dies, you've got no comeback on them, and no one's responsible. It's criminal. It really is criminal what's going on.
I think that's, you know, I'm going to leave that as your personal view, and thank you for expressing it. I can't have anything to say against it. As I said,
No.
The authority of what's happened has come from those two pieces of legislation, the Public Health Act and the Emergency Management Act. And that gives certain delegated authority to the Chief Health Officer. The Chief Health Officer can make recommendations. But what individual employers do, I mean, that's also up to them.
But they get fined if they don't follow the narrative.
Well, there's lots of things that we also, you know, if we don't do things by the rules, these are the risks. So, and again, each employer, just as you as an employee are weighing up risks and benefits, employers are weighing up risks and benefits. Because from an employer perspective, you know, occupational health and safety guidelines is to do things that are considered reasonable to prevent or to prevent problems or dissemination of infection within the workplace, and to provide a safe workspace. And in general, vaccination has been a safe thing to do for many years, since, you know, the late 1700s, when Jenner demonstrated that by infecting someone with cowpox, you prevented them from getting smallpox. That's the birth of vaccination and vaccinology as a sub interest within infectious diseases. So in general, what is the reasonable provision of a safe workplace and a safe work environment? You may disagree at an individual level, but remember, an employer often has to think about more than just one or the individual. And yes, I can see that a lot of these mandates and things are difficult for a lot of people because the element of choice has been taken away. I don't have any authority or control over it, just like you don't.
No.
In the end, it is a decision about, you know, again, and it's all about what your personal values are and what is important to you. But at the moment, those of us that have executive functions, titles or roles have to abide by what has been legislated and approved, irrespective of the individual circumstances. And at the moment, the only means of being able to continue working on a health site beyond, you know, the cut-off dates according to the tiers is on the basis of show you've got your vaccination or you have a clear medical exemption.
Very difficult to get, I've tried.
Correct. And the medical exemptions are very limited. And it's the same thing as what I was talking about with pregnancy and breastfeeding. It is very hard for a medical practitioner to go against what has been, you know.
Well, they're under threat from AHPRA. They can't do anything.
But they have to follow the rules and the recommendations. And as long as you have wriggle room where the evidence is more limited, but the evidence in terms of what is also published in the medical literature is growing and growing in the space of the benefits of vaccination. And even if you disagree, you can look at what's happened in New South Wales. As the vaccination rates have got higher with a greater proportion of the population being vaccinated, you can see the case numbers are been diminishing.
I think they are getting more and more people that are they're getting COVID, although they're double vaxxed, they're getting COVID.
Okay.
They're getting really sick from it because their immune system's being.
Okay, so I'll come back to remember that vaccination doesn't mean you won't get COVID. It's like any vaccination.
Well, it's not really vaccination, is it? In the true sense of the word. It's an mRNA, it's a gene therapy injection, really.
Okay, no, it's not a gene therapy. So the mRNA is using a piece of, yes, genetic material that gets our cells to produce the protein, the spike protein. The spike protein generates an antibody response. That's the immune system. It's a different type, but it's still a vaccine. You are giving something prior to natural infection to prime the immune system so it can recognize a product, a subunit, or some component of natural infection, and trying to provide some mimicry so that when you are then exposed to the natural infection, because your body recognizes this as foreign or not part of yourself, it augments the immune response. And the principle of vaccination for COVID is stopping severe disease, stopping death, stopping hospitalisation. They're the three key things that it's meant to do.
It's not working.
So that is not the initial aim. So said in terms of those concepts of herd immunity, so this is, does it stop spread? The concepts of herd immunity take more time, and that is the only time will tell. In terms of spread, hard to say, but the belief is, so now you're going back to scientific principles rather than hard evidence just at this point in time. Those hard evidence or the theories, hopefully over time, will either be proved or disproved. I don't know. My feeling is they will be proved, but that's my bias as a doctor and also working in infectious diseases. What happens is those people that do have antibodies or do recognise, some foreign agent or something that produce a high amount, so the amount of replication, so the amount of virus produced is lower. There's a certain amount of virus required, so the inoculum, before it reliably causes someone else infection. So the more people get vaccinated, the less severe disease or death. Hopefully it renders the illness a mild or asymptomatic. And because the levels of replication in the virus of the host that's been infected is less, yes, the transmission is less likely, but that will take more time to be assured that that is truly the case.
I was asking that question, like, they don't have the evidence, why would they just not allow certain minority?
So one part is that, so in the more recent outbreak in New South Wales and similarly in Victoria, the people that ended up in intensive care or on ventilators were more likely to be not vaccinated or have no doses of vaccination. Over time, because strains mutate and that sort of thing, and it's not 100% efficacious. So, just because you get vaccinated doesn't mean you prevent every case of COVID or that sort of thing, but it provides the best level of protection that we have at this point in time. We don't have many antiviral drugs. We don't have many immune hydroxychloroquine. No clinical trial has shown that hydroxychloroquine makes a difference to COVID infection.
Ivermectin's been very successful.
Ivermectin has not been shown in clinical trials, so I disagree with that statement. Ivermectin has not been shown in widespread clinical trials to have significant change or benefit. Certain things have. Dexamethasone has in terms of the severity of illness, and the newer agents, tocilizumab, sotrovimab, and a couple of other specific drugs are continuing in their clinical trials and are being used in some other countries. But again, who are the people that tend to be the people who have been unvaccinated? But as I said, you have to make a decision yourself based on the things, but knowing that unfortunately the mandate is here, it's not going away. I can't change it and you can't change it. And medical staff are somewhat restricted in who they can officially give a medical exemption for. Choice is not a medical exemption. And I know it is hard because the choice of choosing not to be vaccinated means choosing not to be employed.
The thing is consent. I've spoken to some of my colleagues who have been vaccinated, and I've asked them about what consent did you get, and they said nothing. I mean, what information, you informed valid consent. Basically, sit down, pull your sleeve up, stick it in, and away you go. They were not told anything about, possible side effects, what to expect. Even the slip within the vial apparently is blank. It's like Kentucky Fried Chicken with their secret herbs and spices. You don't know what's in it.
So the information is available, and you can look up on the TGA, because as it has been registered with the TGA produced documents, and there are documents available explaining what is exactly in each vaccine. So the information is there. I did receive a consenting process when I had my vaccination, and so I can only speak from personal opinion because I'm not someone who's delivering vaccines. But I had a consent process and I was prepared to be vaccinated. Now, obviously, those of you who may be hesitant or uncertain or unsure, you're seeking to find out more information. And there are places where information can be sought and can be found.
Well, I'm working with nurses who didn't want to get the vaccine. They decided they didn't want it. They have basically been coerced into it, again, because you'll lose your job. No jab, no jab, no job type of scenario. That is coercion and bullying and intimidation, which is actually illegal in the consenting process. So it makes the actual consent invalid.
Okay, so that's a consent to have the vaccine. Remember that no jab, no job is not related to who's doing the vaccinations.
No, but it's part of the intimidation and the fact that you are going to be punished.
So I come back to the fact that the order is constructed under the basis of the Emergency Management Act and the Public Health Act.
Still got to follow the law.
Those are the laws in operation, the Emergency Management Act and the Public Health Act. They allow the Chief Health Officer to make a recommendation that vaccines are mandated. So you could, and I know there have been challenges, and challenges are coming before various Supreme Courts and High Courts. Some of the ones in Queensland have been thrown out simply because here are the legislative tools that allow these mandates to be applied. As I said, you can argue and disagree as an individual, but there are legislative constructs that have come through our elected officials, and they have been passed into law. So it'll have to be a challenge within the High Court because it's a constitutional matter.
It will come.
I'm sure it will, but until then, you have a rule that has been applied, and until it's challenged and won, you still have to apply by the rules that we have. And they're the rules that, as I said, the executive and things that are providing, and sort of part of the reason for having this conversation is to try and sort of say, make you aware that clearly it comes down to that same point. Anything we do does have consequences. It's just that the difficult part in this is the fact that the consequences are not of our own making in some ways. The consequence of not being vaccinated, if you're a healthcare or health support worker, is that after the appropriate dates, you will not be allowed on site, you will not be able to continue your employment. It is your choice as to what you do. I'm not here to change your mind, because those people who have concerns and worries have thought about this, like you have, like others have. But I realise that there's significant ramifications for the choices that you make over this weekend for some people.
On the can't access the site. I don't know if I read correctly or not, but if you cannot come here without the vaccine, you're employed. But if you have someone sick, you're allowed to visit them.
Yes. So the restrictions are for healthcare workers and health support workers or employees. Similarly, the same restrictions will come into place for contracted people or contracted individuals. So if you're delivering something, you could be spot audited or spot checked to make sure that to come on a health site, you must be vaccinated. That's the bottom line. It does not apply to patients or visitors. But obviously, if a situation changes and there is widespread community transmission, there may be restrictions on who can visit and that sort of thing. And that will be determined both at site with some leads from the health department and whatever other or new directives get issued.
Not much knowledge on it all. Rapid antigen testing, is that something that is checked if you're positive or negative in what period of time?
Okay, so I'm going to have to get it, but so that this was a question about rapid antigen testing, and we had a little bit of comments about testing. So PCR is simply a platform for doing the testing. It's just an amplification process to detect the genetic material of a virus. And we use, in microbiology, we use a number of PCR tests to detect for viruses because it's the quickest and fastest way to do things, that is most reliable, has the best sensitivity and specificity. Okay? So PCR testing is considered the best way for detecting. The alternative, cell culture, takes too long, it's too laborious. Okay, so that's it, and the time frame is between 2 and 7 days to get an answer. So PCR testing has replaced a lot of cell culture techniques. Rapid testing, so whether that's detecting your antibodies or detecting some antigen or fragment of the virus, yes, what you get is a faster test result at the expense of the sensitivity and the specificity. So that means that there are more false positives and more false negatives as a consequence. So useful when, in general, what you're looking for is making sure that you don't, when you don't want to miss anyone. So you want to more likely, so in a higher transmission sort of thing and a higher likelihood, rapid tests are useful then because they'll tell you positive and then you can get a confirmation test. But not so good to sort of say that it's negative. But like anything, all tests have their place. They're all part of it. So even in, say, the UK, when they've had their first and their second and now their third and fourth waves, they still rely on aspects of the clinical syndrome to make a diagnosis. And if the test does not fit with the clinical syndrome, they may say that either the test was done too early, so it might be a false negative, or it may be representing something else. So you have to, all tests have their limitations, all results. From a medicine perspective, it's about putting all the pieces together that adds up to, okay, well, the picture is most consistent with this diagnosis. And then these are the pieces of evidence that support my diagnostic algorithm or pathway.
How many cycles are they doing here in WA when they're testing the PCR?
Yeah, I don't work in the lab, but I will sort of say that a normal PCR sort of testing, they'll go up to 45 is the normal. So that's the number of, so the purpose is to, it's the amplification process. So that's why they're doing it. And so if you, after a certain number of cycles, the likelihood of detecting fragments of DNA or fragments of any genetic material diminishes. So what you want to do, and they have sort of what's called cutoff components. So, and then it's really a yes or no, but they do have elements of semi-qualitative or semi-quantitative. So if the cutoff happens at a lower number of cycles, it usually won't detect anything until at least 20 are done, because it needs to, because the detection of the test is at a certain level. And then it's usually, if a cutoff is between, say, 20 and 30, it's a more strongly positive, 30 to 35 is weaker, etc.
And I believe that the actual COVID virus still has not been isolated and purified. Same as HIV, has never been isolated and purified. So I'm just wondering, how can they make a so-called vaccine for something that you can't see?
Okay, so
According to cost share.
so I think there's I would come back to sort of say that they've sequenced things, so they can detect a genetic code.
We've got 37 components out of 30,000.
So, and remember what the vaccine is about is producing a component of the actual virus. So if you look at vaccines in general, there's a whole different range. So we can have live vaccines. So they've taken, so chickenpox, for example, or varicella vaccine are live vaccines. They take the virus, they alter its genetic components so it doesn't replicate well, or it doesn't cause, it's deficient in some way, but it still produces the response that you want. And there's a risk with live vaccines of causing the disease. Then you can have whole killed, which we do for other viruses and other things. Then we can look at a component. So in the hepatitis B vaccine, which is the surface antigen, what we're doing is what we're trying to do is produce that component of the vaccine, and that's what we get antibodies against. So that the surface antigen is what we give, a replica of it, and we ask our immune system to produce antibodies against that. So what's different about this? We want the spike protein, because we've said that the spike protein is the immune part or the immunogenic part of this coronavirus. And if we can produce reliable antibodies to that spike protein, we may render the disease less virulent. So make you less sick, make you less likely to end up in hospital, etc. And the way they've done it is different to previously. Rather than getting the protein product, purifying that and injecting that into your arm, they have chosen to produce messenger RNA that goes into the cell, asks the cell machinery to start producing the protein that gets released. And by doing that, it's the cell product or the protein product is within yourself, but our antigen presenting cells recognize it as foreign, present it to the right sort of cells that then produces the immune response. And whether it's the messenger RNA or whether it's the adenovirus vector, it's doing the same thing in bringing the code to our cells to produce the protein that then makes the antibodies.
There's no off switch.
What happens is it doesn't last very long.
It keeps getting made and made, and it's an endless loop. What I've read, can't turn it off, it'll just keep going and going and going.
It was not what I have read.
Okay. And they didn't realise that until they actually put it out in production.
Sorry, there's a question. Okay, so the question from Seha Wali is, why is there a push to vaccinate everyone when the people that have chosen to be vaccinated theoretically are protected? So then in theory, they should not get ill from getting COVID. So why force everyone to get vaccinated? So the mandate isn't on everyone. The mandate is for selected populations at this point in time. And the mandate is to those that are potentially at greatest risk of transmitting or causing our most vulnerable members of society to get infected with COVID. So, but then, other vaccines, other vaccines aren't mandated. This vaccine has been mandated by our Chief Health Officer. And part of the push at the moment is in preparation for borders opening.
But if New South Wales or Victoria have been vaccinated 80%, why are we scared? The whole country has been vaccinated, say about 80%. Why should we be scared of borders opening?
So at the moment, the amount of circulating. So why are we worried about borders opening? What about numbers of vaccination? So within WA, we do not have established community transmission of COVID. The only cases of COVID that we have are those people in hotel quarantine. That's all that we have. We've had a couple of scares that we've had lockdowns for when there was a risk or a possibility that it could have escaped into the community and set up a propagation chain. So a chain reaction, which is what happened in New South Wales and in Victoria. The virus escaped from the mechanisms that were trying to keep it under control, went out for various different reasons. So we have been fortunate. The risk is we've been living this life for this part of the pandemic. But the pandemic has been going on around the world in different stages, in ebbs and flows, depending on how close people are, how far apart they are, what levels of vaccination, what levels of non-vaccination there are, etc. So the risk is when borders open, free travel and movement, we see more likely the transmission of viruses. We've seen that with influenza. Okay, so influenza is really related to travel because influenza hasn't been circulating as much in Australia in the past 18 months, where we've not had travel between the northern and southern hemisphere.
Is that because it's called COVID?
No, because the tests,
PCR test.
yes, they can.
That's why they're stopping it.
No, I'm sorry, that is not true. There's very different structures of the virus that mean that it is detectable and distinguishable through testing, including PCR. Through a PCR test, it can, because the primers are different and the products are different. So your statement is wrong, I'm sorry to say.
Well, it depends where you get information.
But in terms of being, borders opening, because it's a change. It's a change to what has been happening within Western Australia, within Perth. You have to accept that if a border opens, there's the possibility of that infection arriving. It's also part of the principle of how, things have globalized and spread much faster. It's also part of the why this pandemic occurred. We are a global sort of community. We are no longer as isolated as we are. Advances in technology and transportation have allowed us to do and to move around more freely. The exhausting part, I think, of some of you, and certainly from my point of view, is when is it going to happen and how do we best prepare? And so coming back to the thing, this mandate is partly that preparation component. At the moment, this is felt to be the best way to prevent or limit further transmission of COVID. The alternative is to remain in a lockdown state. Well, that's what a lot of people thought, but there's not a lot of action in the gastrointestinal tract for COVID-19. There are some, but all coronaviruses affect the respiratory and to a lesser extent the gastrointestinal system. It is 3 o'clock. I just check if anyone else online has any questions that they wish to ask. No one has their hand up. I'm going to ask anyone else in the room if you have a question or comment. I will say thank you to all for attending. I hope it's been helpful. I hope it's been an opportunity to talk. I wish you the best in whatever way you choose to tackle this, understanding that, this is it's not been easy for many people. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's have a coffee.